Muchas gracias, Aloisio. Bueno, seguramente a ustedes les ha pasado lo mismo, ¿no? A mí me surgían situaciones y nombres conforme iba escuchando. Inclusive el mío, por supuesto.
El principio de la confianza de seriedad, no puede hacer hablar.
Exactamente. Bueno, ahora vamos a hacer un ejercicio más complicado porque nuestro siguiente invitado viene de muy lejos. Nick Temple es presidente de la Sociedad Británica de Psicoanálisis, sociedad con la cual tenemos, por supuesto, muchísimos vínculos. Le bromeaba a Moisés con Nick en el almuerzo porque nuestros founding fathers vienen de la Sociedad Británica, así que tenemos ahí una relación muy estrecha y muy personal. Y no obstante, a diferencia de lo que pasa en Brasil, me contaba Nick en el almuerzo, de que algo de esto hablaremos, que en Inglaterra hay dos sociedades psicoanalíticas, es decir, ¿no? Uno de los países con mayor influencia, si es que no el que más tiene influencia en el mundo del psicoanálisis, y sin embargo en todas partes se cuecen habas. Aunque, como diría Max Hernández, citando a César Moro, el problema del Perú es que solo se cuecen habas. Pero el ejercicio, les decía, va a ser complicado porque Nick, nos va a hablar de su experiencia. Él es una persona que está haciendo importantes reformas en la Sociedad Británica de Psicoanálisis y, por supuesto, esto genera una serie de resistencias, que es exactamente el tema de su trabajo. Lo complicado va a ser que él va a hablar en inglés, pero muy amablemente ha acortado un poco su trabajo para poder encajar dentro del horario. Entonces vamos a ver cómo hacemos, porque Ilse, tú tradujiste, ¿verdad? Aprovecho para agradecerle a Ilse Reder, a mi querida Ilse, porque ella hizo la traducción. Pero como lo ha recortado Nick, ahí vamos a tener que hacer algunos cambalaches para poder entendernos, pero bueno, de eso se trata todo esto también. Yo traduciré lo que pueda sobre la parte que él va a decir inicialmente, que creo que no está en el texto. Pero yo sé que todos ustedes son bilingües y hablan perfectamente inglés, así que Nick, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I apologize for the whole problem of translation. I wish to begin with one or two remarks just to introduce my paper, which is a clinical theoretical discussion, and I wanted Jorge, if you would just translate one or 2 points. Firstly, I'm presenting a short discussion of the pathological superego with a brief clinical case. I think this example is important to understanding how superego pathology can block development in many of our patients. And I wanted to say that this superego function is frequently projected, and it may be projected into others, and others may react to it.
Maybe I should translate.
Yes.
A ver, Nick me pide que les diga que va a iniciar haciendo una breve discusión a través de un caso clínico de una situación de superyó patológico y cómo esto puede dar lugar a proyecciones que nos van a poner retos clínicos complicados.
Thank you. I believe that unconscious forms of destructive superego are projected also in organizations, which can be related to resistance to change and creativity in organizations, and here I think particularly of psychoanalytic organizations. These problems exist in many ways in our psychoanalytic institutions. And Aloisio's paper really refers to some aspects of that. But I wanted to focus on the way in which the disturbance of the superego may be important in an institution. Yeah?
Entonces, lo que a él le interesa es, en realidad, también enfatizar cómo estas formas patológicas superyoicas se dan en el seno de las instituciones psicoanalíticas. Y él está, en fin, muy contento por que el trabajo de Aloisio ya ha introducido esta particular situación a la que él se va a referir, y él quiere darnos algunos ejemplos precisos sobre cómo es que esto sucede en el seno de las instituciones.
Thank you. And finally, I just wanted to mention my interest in the nature of the superego in totalitarian societies, which I think sometimes mirrors an internal totalitarian state in some patients, and also such a state that can exist in an organization as well.
Y finalmente quiere también expresar o mostrar su interés en el funcionamiento superyoico en situaciones totalitarias y cómo esto se puede, de hecho se reproduce en la situación clínica, tal como sucede también en la situación institucional.
Thank you. I will now read the paper. Yes, and there are some pieces I've cut, so I will say when I will just mention, so you can move on. Yes, sorry, I tried to shorten it. I'd like to explore some questions which arise in treating patients who are unable to move forward in their development. I'll focus on the resistance to treatment derived from the superego and its impact also on the countertransference. Therapeutic change depends on altering the patient's internal relationship to the superego, and the analyst's role in facilitating this change is central. Patients who seek analytic treatment for depression often present complex and difficult problems for the clinician. A pattern is often established over many years and becomes part of the patient's personality. A repetitive cycle is present in which good relationships are damaged by the attacks from the superego. This leads to self-reproach and guilt, and the persecutory nature of the guilt leads to further attacks on the self. In these patients, there is a limited capacity to learn from guilt, and as a consequence, it is difficult to break the cycle of damage, retaliation, punishment, and self-reproach. An awareness of depressive guilt, when it develops, can strengthen the ability to take responsibility for harm done and to support efforts at reparation. The pattern of blaming and attacking, then suffering guilt and punishment is in retaliation, has a sadomasochistic quality. I'm going to miss the rest of that paragraph. Freud first used the term superego, defining it as an internal voice which is a critic and judge of the ego, but also an object in the inner world which has complex interactions with different internal representations. In Freud's original description, as you know, the superego came into existence at the resolution of the Oedipus complex. The authority of the father, which had been resisted, was accepted and internalized. In 1930, Freud, acknowledging Melanie Klein's views, attributed the aggression of the superego to the infant's projection of aggression onto the parents, which was then internalized. I'll miss the rest of that paragraph. Freud suggested that the superego is also internalized from the interaction with both parents, including an identification with the parents' own superego functions. You should not only listen to me, the parent says, but listen to the father inside me. The supernatural quality of the superego seems to have that the superego seems to have in the personality may derive from such inherited ancestors with their fantasied existence inside the parents. This, of course, has a relationship to religion in which the superego may be represented by God. Ron Britton has considered this in his discussion of Job's relationship with God. And of course, I would add here the note that the analytic elders may occupy this position. Melanie Klein described the struggle in the depressive position to develop a capacity for mature guilt based on pain and remorse, taking responsibility for inflicting injury on another. This is distinct from the fearful guilt in the paranoid position with its persecutory anxiety. An internal accusation by a punitive superego leads to the persecuted feeling of guilt. When the analysis allows the character of the superego to become more conscious, it may be modified and the patient has the potential to become less dominated by pathological elements of the superego. Britton calls this the emancipation of the superego, the emancipation of the ego from the superego, and this is a key part of the therapeutic process. Britton makes an important point about the location of guilt. In the case of persecutory anxiety, the guilt is experienced as an internal accusation, that is, from the superego to the ego. But in the depressive position, guilt is an affect of the ego. It is an instance of the ego reclaiming a function for itself, taking responsibility and diminishing the power of the superego in terms of an act of emancipation. It is this latter form of guilt, of depressive guilt, which allows development and learning to take place, which is so often absent in depressed patients. The concept of the pathological superego as a critical agency, which has become split off from the self, making the subject feel criticized and denigrated, is central to understanding melancholia and severe depression. Freud described this in Mourning and Melancholia, as you know. He also spelt it out clearly in The Ego and the Id. If we turn, to quote him, if we turn to melancholia first, we find that the excessively strong superego, which has obtained a hold upon consciousness, rages against the ego with merciless violence, as if it had taken hold of the whole of the sadism available in the person concerned. Following our view of sadism, we should say that the destructive component has entrenched itself in the superego and turns against the ego. What is now holding sway, he thought, was a pure culture of the death instinct. Then I've missed the next paragraph. Bion's theory of containment identifies how the failure of maternal containment of destructive projections from the baby may be at the root of formation of the ego, destructive superego. And this is also one explanation of the origin of a lifelong tendency to depression. Clearly, the mother's own superego functioning, her internal world, and her external relationships will have an important effect on her capacity to contain and modify the child's projections. Ron Britton, in his discussion of the ego, destructive superego, points out the terrible outcome which occurs when there is an egosyntonic identification with a murderous superego, resulting in a conscienceless killer. In some patients, a rapid change of identification with the superego can take place to make the act of suicide suddenly become egosyntonic, resulting in a murder of the self. underlining the strong connection there is between suicide and murder. In this discussion of the ego-destructive superego, Britton describes those patients who are not totally identified with the superego, but are internally menaced by its hostility when they show signs of independent development, sexual maturity, or creativity. These patients can develop ways of placating the menacing superego and concealing evidence of development, sexuality, or creativity. Then I missed the next 2 paragraphs. I've struggled with this clinical problem in analytic work when I experienced myself pitted against a harsh moral authority in my patient's mind, which judges the analytic relationship to be bad, yet this same authority gives support to attitudes that cause damage to the patient. The patient's request for help is denigrated, and so is the offer of assistance, represented by the analysis. I missed the latter part of that paragraph, and going on to the next one, which is the attacks upon analytic work are similar to the attacks on other forms of help and on the good aspects of the patient, leading to denigration of the self and a justification for suicide. Attempts to break off the analytic work on the grounds of its worthlessness take place, and when these are successful, there is a triumph of destructiveness over hope, and hope is claimed to be worthless. Then I miss the next paragraph. In these states, the patient suffers from distortion of judgment, which is persistent and stable. Receiving help is felt to be a form of weakness and would undermine a self-righteous position. When a patient's conscience functions in this way, the superego is taken over by a primitive regressive state. Clinical observation suggests that patients whose superego is functioning in this way have an impaired capacity to make judgments and may be confused as to what is true and what is false, and also what is beneficial and what is harmful to them. This state of affairs for an individual can be compared with that which occurs in a society when it becomes dominated by a violent and corrupt government. For example, in a dictatorship where distorted values damaging to the society and its citizens are put forward as being good and virtuous. When an advanced and complex society is taken over in this way, it demonstrates that distortions of moral authority and conscience can predominate even when opposed by the structure and organization of a democratic society. This indicates the extent to which healthy superego functions, represented by reasonable government authority, are prone to pathology and distortion, as we see an example of the Nazi regime and many other tyrannies. While it is difficult to reconstruct the parental relationship which has influenced the formation of the superego, there is often evidence that severe distortions of superego function have come about as a result of difficulties in the patient's development, as well as major problems in the relationship with the parents. The unconscious relationship with the parents' inner world has a powerful part to play in the formation of superego pathology. I missed the next paragraph, next three paragraphs. The internal relationship with the superego acts as a powerful voice in the patient's mind and becomes a third voice in the dialogue with the analyst and sets up opposition to the analytic work. This can be observed in the detailed pattern of sessions when, for example, an acknowledgement of the attachment to the analyst is countered immediately by a wish to reduce contact, as if there is a move forward and then an obstruction. This intensification of guilt brought about by the therapeutic change with a move towards autonomy from a severe superego can lead to a negative therapeutic reaction. Then positive change leads to the patient feeling worse or becoming ill. This negative reaction gives release or relief from the unconscious sense of guilt derived from conflict with the superego. It reverses the process of emancipation of the ego from the superego. I wanted to give a short clinical example, and I've chosen to discuss a patient who demonstrated these themes strongly and who broke off treatment. However, the same issues exist with many patients, which can be a major obstruction to analytic work. Mrs. B, aged 36, was referred because of anxieties about her aggressive feelings towards her daughter and her long-standing depression. She was despairing and frustrated that she could not move forward or make use of her considerable talent and intelligence. She was a forceful, clever person who demanded answers to her many questions. She had a strident manner of speech and tended to demolish answers or statements with contemptuous logic. She was intolerant of minor mistakes and used her criticism of them to attempt to humiliate me because she did not trust me and wanted to demonstrate my weakness. Her allegation is that any error indicates a total failure of her capacity to provide help. She shows contempt for any form of vulnerability or dependence in herself or in me, the analyst. I had the experience of continually walking a tightrope between being an incompetent, weak figure on the one hand, or on the other hand, if I pointed out this was exaggerated, I was then experienced as a bullying, cruel, dictatorial figure who was forcing dogmatic views onto her. There seemed to be only two possible positions, a sadistic, powerful one on one hand, and a weak, masochistic on the other. And she felt that she and the analyst were occupying always one position or the other. At the outset of her treatment, Mrs. B was in a stable state of unhappiness which had lasted since her adolescence 20 years before. Although she was of high ability, she could achieve little, and her personal relationships were unhappy. I missed the next paragraph. In the analysis, she expressed mistrust for what the analysis represented. She gave many examples of how psychoanalysis had failed, and she pointed out the weakness and dogmatism of psychoanalysis. She pointed out that I was weak and dependent because of my attachment to analysis, which itself encouraged dependency. At other times, she suggested that my attachment to psychoanalysis was based on my narcissistic self-aggrandizement and self-seeking, which merely made use of her as material for proving that I was superior by making her conform to my dogmatic theories. She stated that I had no knowledge of the difficulties and sacrifice she might have to cope with in order to engage in psychoanalysis because I was insulated from the problems of the real world by my comfortable life. Analysis was therefore a luxury to be indulged in a dependent way if you were insulated from the pressures and dangers of the world. I felt that the patient was informing me about the nature of her ruthless internal world, which could not afford to invest hope in analysis and the relationship with me because she faced dangers and threats from an internal superego which I did not know about. Then I missed the rest of that paragraph and the next one. The counter-transference experience of these attacks became worse as my sense of concern for Mrs. B had increased. It became evident that this was the pattern of her relationships, and I, in the analysis, represented another opportunity which she felt compelled to demolish. It became evident that she was maintaining a stable defensive system, a psychic retreat in Steiner's terms, perhaps. That kept a sense of failure and disappointment intact and was rooted in sadomasochism, and that this was a kind of internal tyranny, which is how she described, in fact, her depression. The patient had reacted strongly to the summer break, which made her more acutely aware of her involvement with me. There were beginning to be marked improvements in her depression and in her capacity to work. She had taken some significant steps forward in her personal life and in developing her career. She announced that a new job would mean that the analysis would have to come to an end because of the pressure on her time. The following day, she described a dream in which a woman was attacked on the steps of a Victorian house, rather like my house. The woman was killed with a sword. Actually, it was a samurai sword. She associated the woman with a helpful female psychiatrist who she connected with me. The murderer was a dark figure she could not recognize, and she watched what happened. She had an association to another dream in which a tiger was lying in wait to attack the lady coming out of the house. This dream seemed to be an acknowledgement of the murdering that was taking place, but she could not fully accept this and said she did not know what the dream was about. The following day, she brought another dream, which was a version of the recurrent persecutory dream, which sometimes spread into paranoid worries about being watched or followed. She was 15 minutes late for the session and thought I was irritated and would not wait. She said that she saw a tramp in the dreams, she saw a tramp on the corner of the road where she lived as a child. He looked unpleasant and threatening. He followed her back to the house, and she feared her children would be harmed. She tried to telephone, but it was cut off and there was nobody to help her. She thought she would be killed. I had linked this dream to her being left on her own with this destructive figure who would punish her, as she had killed off the link with me. Her determination was, her determination was that the analysis would have to be killed off, and her reluctance to negotiate in any way about this made me believe that something valuable had to be done to death. I and the analysis were to be got rid of. I was not able to stop this acting out of a killing. Indeed, I experienced myself as unable to defend something vulnerable against this attack. I believe that the growing strength of the analytic work had provoked a reaction against it, which was based on a negative therapeutic reaction. The analysis had to be smashed to pieces because of what would need to be faced if it were to continue. This would inevitably mean giving up the power of the destructiveness and becoming more vulnerable and facing guilt. Just a brief discussion. Mrs. B demonstrates, I think, the problem and risks of analytic treatment of such patients. Although she has asked for help and has sought help in the past from several different therapists, she has never managed to sustain treatment and made progress. She broke off the analysis prematurely when things were beginning to develop. There is a dangerous opposition against allowing herself to accept help and to form an alliance in the analysis. She believed that acknowledging dependency is risky and will lead to her being let down or exploited and taken advantage of. She has a picture of humiliation and vulnerability which is associated with needing help, and she would rather remain aloof and identified with a superior and contemptuous figure, while I'm the needy one who is trying to persuade her to continue the analysis. In this way, she remains loyal to the critical superego and opposes the possibility of change, so she traps herself in depression with this frightening internal figure. Then I missed the next part of the paragraph, and I go down to this progress related to my steady capacity to resist the attacks and to describe and interpret what was taking place. Despite her frequent dismissal of it, something had happened. In relation to Strachey's view that the therapeutic effect of analysis was the result of the modification of the superego, which resulted from the projection onto the analyst and their introjection in a more benign form, there was evidence of this taking place with Mrs. B. Britton's notion of the emancipation of the ego from the superego is illustrated by his discussion of Job's challenge to God. In his view, God is no longer idealized and can be criticized and challenged. Thus, the superego is open to scrutiny and challenge and is dislodged from its omniscient position. Mrs. B did challenge the hegemony of this superego and also had a capacity to describe the paranoid world in which she lived when she remained loyal to it. I think this is quite explicit in the two dreams where the good object is killed off and she is left with a menacing figure. Then I've missed the next paragraph and then the final paragraph. If the improvement in depression is related to a strengthening of the ego's capacity for thought, which challenges the omniscience of the superego, then the analyst's own ability to observe, think will be vital. This is related to the ability to learn from depressive guilt, both in the analyst and in the patient. Mrs. B has little capacity to learn from a sense of remorse or responsibility, although this was beginning to change when she broke off treatment. She illustrates these difficulties in an extreme form, and her directness enables the attack on the analysis to be seen more clearly than is often the case, although I think many forms of this kind of resistance exist. Thank you.
Thank you.